The world around us is hostile to the Word of God and to biblical values, but we are called to be salt and light, to stand for truth in a decaying culture. We are not called to run from the fire, but be willing to step into the fire. God has placed you at this time in history on purpose and for a purpose. Join us as we get better equipped to address civics and culture from a biblical worldview. Welcome to Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church. Let's welcome our hosts Allison Furno and Debi Vandenboom.
Today's topic is the dark underbelly of the abortion industry. So this is going to be a little different one because Sam Oriza, our guest co-host, is going to be interviewing me. We're going to have a conversation. She has some things to contribute as well because of her background in college. But I do want to just give a little say something at the very beginning to kind of get prepared for this. First of all, we are going to be discussing abortion, and I just want to make sure that we say right up front that if you are listening and you have an abortion in your past, that there is forgiveness and freedom, that God wants you to be forgiven and set free from anything in your past, including an abortion. If you need to talk to somebody, that you can reach out to Dream City Church. We have a ministry for that, and also pretty much any pro-life pregnancy center also has classes, Bible studies for women who've had an abortion. We don't want anyone to feel condemned. We are going to talk rather frankly and bluntly about this issue today. So with that also, if you are listening with young children around, you may want to put headphones in or preview it before you let young children listen to it. We're not going to get too graphic, but it is, the stuff that we're talking about is not
heavy.
It is a little edgy, right? So with that also, you may want to have a piece of paper and a pen to write some things down so that you can do some research on your own. We're going to be talking about things, but we want you to go look these things up for yourself. Don't just take our word for it, what we're saying. All of this stuff is verifiable. You can look it up and find the things that we're talking about. We'll point you in the direction of that as we go as well. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with all of that.
Yes.
Out of the way.
All right, Debi, well, how long have you been involved in the life issue?
Yeah, so I have been involved in the pro-life arena for over 20 years. So my daughter, who's 22, I was pregnant with her, and I was doing civic-related ministry, helping other young moms get involved and informed. And I watched, I was looking up information about partial birth abortion. They were talking about banning it at the federal level. And I was reading this it was like a little 3-part medical book drawing, nothing graphic or gory, but I was looking at this, realizing what they were, because I think, and this is going to come up as we're talking today, because we've already talked about this in our discussion.
Yes.
About reading things or hearing terms and not really stopping to think, what does that mean? What are they talking about? And I think this is why there's so much darkness that goes on under our noses, is because we're hearing these words and we don't really pay attention and stop and think what those things mean.
Right.
So this was one of them. They were talking about partial birth abortion, and I looked at this medical drawing and I was appalled. And I was around 7 months pregnant, and it was like an ice pick to my heart. And I was, how are we even talking about whether or not this is okay? Who is defending this, this atrocity?
Yeah.
And I spent a long time with the Lord that day and just left there knowing that for the rest of my life, literally it was a mandate from God.
Yeah.
I can say that because it's been 20 plus years that I was going to look at all the ugly things, look at the things that were difficult to look at, and not ever shut up about it. I was going to talk about it, even if I was the only person talking about it. Yeah. And that led me into, so I did a lot of, on the political arena, I sat in on a ton of legislation. All of the pro-life bills that we've had in Arizona, I've sat in on them at the state legislature. And then ended up starting a pro-life ministry here at Dream City Church in 2010, helping women who are pregnant, helping young moms, and helping women who've had an abortion that regret it. And so it's been a very long time. I've looked at it from every conceivable angle. I've looked at the science, at the medical side of it, talked to abortion providers, women who've had abortions, all kinds from literally from every angle. We've had a bunch of episodes on this podcast from a bunch of different angles as well on that topic, but this is a little bit different of a topic today.
Yes, a little bit different.
Yeah.
And talking more about what most people aren't aware about with the abortion industry and how...
What I like to call the mega abortion industrial complex.
Yes, mega abortion industrial complex. We'll have to come up with an acronym.
Right? I mean, because it's a business.
It's true.
And we're going to talk about that.
It is a business and it's very lucrative. And a lot of people, the flashlight's never shown over there. So we need to start talking about it and raising awareness. But with that, mainly about Planned Parenthood and other abortion providers that have been committing crimes throughout how long?
Yeah,
honestly,
a
long time. But can you give us some examples of those crimes?
Yeah. So, and we're not talking about the abortions themselves, right? So we're talking outside of abortions. The abortion industry is kind of notorious in things that they get away with, or that they are accused of or pay penalties for, but you never hear about in the news, right? And there's a long list of them, and they're not just Planned Parenthood. There are other abortion providers as well, and these are all things that you can look up. You can Google them, you can verify them. So don't take our word for it. These are things that are easy to look up, right? But there are things like Medicaid fraud. So this is something that, I mean, I know they've talked about even defunding Planned Parenthood at a national level, but Medicaid is really where they get a lot of their money, because both at the federal level and the state level, they charge Medicaid. So there are cases, and you can look them up. I know that ADF has handled a few of them. They've happened in multiple states, where they either are illegally, that the state is not supposed to, state Medicaid money is not supposed to go to abortion, which is something that happened recently in Texas, that there was a case, but there are also lots of cases of them double billing or repeat billing for the same thing, where they charge something and then double charge it or extra charge or whatever they're doing, right? They're doing some financial gymnastics in there of how they're billing things and committing fraud in the process of doing that. So there have been a lot of cases of those that are on file. You can look at court proceedings. That's one thing. There have been multiple wrongful death lawsuits. There was one involving Planned Parenthood. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on these. I'll let you look them up, but we're just going to kind of highlight a few of these. There was a wrongful death of a woman named Tanya Reeves, Reaves, that was at Planned Parenthood in, I think, New York or somewhere, Chicago. She was in Chicago, a wrongful death that they were responsible for her death. There was another case that was not a Planned Parenthood case. It was Southwestern Women's Options in Albuquerque, New Mexico, a woman named Keisha Atkins that died during a late-term abortion as well, died of sepsis. And they had drugged her into oblivion, giving her opioids and even I'm trying to think of what's the drug that's big right now over the border.
Fentanyl?
Fentanyl.
Yeah.
I don't know why that.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Giving her drugs that level of drugs, right? She had been drugged into an oblivion, they were telling her not to go to the emergency room. When she finally did go to the emergency room, she died. This was not a Planned Parenthood case. It was a different one. But what ends up happening with those is that when they settle out of, they end up settling, and part of the lawsuit settlement is a non-disclosure agreement where they're not allowed to talk about it. So then these things get buried, right? You hear about them on the news, but then they get buried. There are a lot of cases of that where it's difficult to find that information because they take money, they're given money, but then they're not allowed to talk about it anymore. So there's multiple of that. There's also been a long history of sex abuse cover-up. So this is one of the things I have personally talked about a lot, is that when you have a 15-year-old going into Planned Parenthood with an adult, that they're not reporting those things, and then just handing them back over to their abusers, right? So there's two different things that have exposed this. One was a long time ago, I want to say 2010-ish, right? there was a thing called the Mona Lisa Project that Live Action did. This was Live Action was brand new at the time. They went in undercover to clinics all across the country. So you can still look those up on YouTube. They're called the Mona Lisa Project from Live Action, and see these videos. And the girl would go in posing as younger than the age limit in the state. So whatever the age limit was, she said she was 13 or 14, depending on what the state law was, and said that the father of the baby was an adult, so 30 years old, 26 years old,
right?
And in all of these cases, she was told that they weren't going to say anything, the guy would not get in trouble, and in some cases, they told her how to go to another state to get an abortion without her parents knowing about it.
Wow.
So this was an undercover expose that happened, but then there are also some real life cases. Again, ADF has a whole big thing. They have, if you look up ADF, sex abuse cover-up, Planned Parenthood, they have a document that goes through and details real life cases of girls who went into Planned Parenthood, were taken in by their abuser, were given an abortion, it was never reported, and they were sent back and suffered more abuse afterwards because it's basically a way for sex abusers to cover up their crimes, because then the evidence goes away. You know, finding out that someone is pregnant is a way to say, hey, what's going on?
Right.
And so then it covers up that. So that's one. And then there's also some fetal organ trafficking, which we're going to talk about more at the end.
Yeah.
But that's another one that there was David DeLayden that exposed that, where they were illegally selling fetal organs of babies that were aborted. Then there have been a couple of really high-profile cases, like Kermit Gosnell. That's one. If you've never heard that case, that one's awful and disgusting. And there's a movie that was made. Have you seen that?
Oh no, what's a movie?
It's called Gosnell.
Oh, it is. Oh, I haven't heard of that.
There's a movie called Gosnell. They did a pretty good job with it, actually.
Okay.
They don't always like sometimes they're like a little. Cheesy,
I know.
They're like,
I like to call them. They're the
cheesy.
indie Christian films. Give them grace.
Yeah,
but
sometimes the quality is not that great. But
But-
this one was actually pretty well
Good.
done, and it's a
Okay.
real life case. Kermit Gosnell is in prison. I think he's still alive, but he was in Philadelphia and just had a horrendous clinic that was like, he was passing STDs from patient to patient, had like rats and like baby feet in the refrigerator next to people's lunch, and like, I mean, it's think a serial killer and multiply it by about 10, and this is what you've got. And what's crazy about that clinic had been reported multiple times. It had never been inspected ever, and the only reason that this stuff was uncovered was because there was a narcotics ring operating out of there, and so there was a drug bust that exposed all of this. The people, the law enforcement went in and were like, what did we just walk into? Because it was like a
horror scene.
Horror. They called it a house of horrors. That was the title. I mean, in like the headlines. That was one. There was another one. Another person was Klopfer, I think is how you say his name. Klopher, or Pfer. That he was an abortionist that was operating out of Indiana, and he died. And when he died, his family found boxes and boxes of fetal remains stashed in his house, in his car, in his garage, like all over the place, because he had not been disposing of them. So he'd just been keeping them, these boxes of like medical.
Disgusting.
Like it was
medical waste.
He had it. He didn't want to pay for the medical. There was something that went on with that, but it was just, again, disgusting.
Yeah.
That got exposed. So it's like the way that they're disposing of these human remains is a big deal. And then the last one is the Justice for the Five. Look that up, because that was one where these fetal remains were being taken from Washington Surgery Center in Washington, D.C., and they were being used to power a city. So I think it was Baltimore, a nearby city to Washington, D.C., that they were burning these fetal remains, medical waste, to power a city, right? And when the guy who was delivering or picking up these remains and taking them, there were some pro-life activists outside that told him what was in the barrels. He didn't know what was in them. And he let them have one of them, and they uncovered, and there were 5 babies that were very late term that looked like they had been either born alive and then killed, or aborted using illegal partial birth abortion. horrendous, awful story. This is ongoing. This was recent. That was in like 2020, 2022, something like that. It was very recent. 2022, Justice for the Five. And some of the people that were arrested and put in prison using the FACE Act were protesting outside that clinic. Protesting what was happening in that clinic. And they were thrown in federal prison. The doctor, quote,
around the same time,
doctor, because that's not a medical professional as far as I'm concerned. But the abortionist is still practicing, still there. Nothing has happened to him. So there are lots of criminal things that happen that either get swept under the rug, they don't get prosecuted, or they're not found out about till after the fact, right? I mean, we'll get into the one with David DeLayden, but he was the journalist had legal issues, but the abortion providers did not. The ones who were selling fetal organs did not. We'll talk about that one in a minute. But there's a lot of criminal activity that goes on in that industry.
100%. Well, and I think, which kind of segues into a little bit of our next point in question, is the fact that I don't think a lot of people realize that the medical industry is not regulated, and not heavily regulated. Like, labs aren't inspected regularly. And so we hear people talk about old cell lines, which can be used in vaccines, other medical research. I know I have some things to say about this. Do you have anything to say about the cell lines and how they're used nowadays, I guess?
I'll set that up and I'll let you explain what they are, and then I might add something to that. But this is talking about, because I know this comes out a lot when you're talking about vaccines, that there are what they call old cell lines, that everybody's like, oh, that's not a big deal. It's no big deal that they use these, because those are, some of them are babies that were aborted in the 60s or in the 70s or the 80s. And they what they do is they keep replenishing, they keep having those cells reproduce. So they took these aborted cells, they keep reproducing them, and they use them to grow cultures, right? When they're testing diseases, testing vaccines, they use them. And so this is something that even the Catholic Church has said, oh, it's okay to take these vaccines because those things they're old cell lines that happened a long time ago, and they're just taking and they're keeping these cells alive, they're reproducing the cells. But a lot of people don't realize that these things are in those vaccines, a lot of them, and in medications and things that we have. They're used in medical research a lot. And they're not, you can see them if you ask for the insert. So I'll let you explain about the letters and the things that are on there. But you can see them, but people look at them and they don't know what they are. Right. They don't realize that that's what they're looking at. That that's what's in there.
And so a lot of times in the medical industry, and I'll tell the story of the first time I actually kind of came into contact in the medical or in science. I was a junior in college, and we were in our cell bio lab, and we had it every week. You go in and they give you a background on what cells you're going to be using in your experiment, what organism they came from, kind of how the organism lived, what you're going to be doing with it, etc. That's how every lab ran, and you did it individually, basically. I remember showing up one day to lab, and all it said about the cells that we were using were they're HEK cells. You're going to be doing this XYZ to them and present your findings. Okay, I look at it. I had kind of been around the pro-life. I've been in church. I knew about Planned Parenthood, and abortions, all these things, right? And so I'd seen HEK before. I just didn't really recognize it off the top of my head. So I pulled out my phone and I looked it up, and it stands for human embryonic kidney cells. And so I read through the lab. Nowhere did it say that's what we were using.
Right.
So I had approached my professor because I had kind of a spirit check. I was like, wait a second, what are we doing? What am I using?
Because this was at a Christian university. Right.
And
I want to establish that.
Yeah.
I feel like that's important. Yeah.
100%. And so I go to my professor and I was asking him, hey, we're using HEK cells. Can you tell me where we got them from? And he couldn't answer me, and he didn't want to answer me. And so I told him that I could not perform the lab because I didn't feel okay, like right inside performing this procedure, and that I was very disappointed that it wasn't elaborated on like what they were as well, the cells that we were using. And a few students had noticed that I'd gotten up to leave, which was very rare. That doesn't happen in biology class. And they were asking why I had left. And I was like, I didn't really want to cause a scene, but I was like, look up what HEK stands for. And what I had come to find is a lot of the times, either when it's almost like an ingredients list when you're reading either what's composed in a vaccine or in medicine, different things that are used or in their procedure, they'll just say, 293 cells were used. HEK, there's a list. There's several of them, and they talk about how old cell lines, all these things, well, you can still create them today from human embryonic kidney cells. People still do that in the medical industry. And they use the embryonic stem cells a lot in research. That's a big thing that people don't really talk about, but it's because the cells are so pliable and they reproduce very fast. You're able to study them really quickly. Right. And so to the scientist brain, oh yeah, of course I want to use that, but in ethically speaking, like that's where the line you're like, okay, this is where we need to stop and see what are we doing, what are like in science, right? And so yeah, but that's a little bit more about HEK cells, and there's a lot. If you look it up, there are different studies done, and even the original HEK 293 female human embryonic fetus that it came from, the background story on that is very wishy-washy as well. If you read the historic, like the original scientific paper on it, very wishy-washy. Because when that all happened, when I was in college, I went back and read it because I was like, what's going on and why are we purchasing these things? And I'd found out why we purchased HEK cells because it was the first time in my university's history that we'd also used them in that lab. And I said, why didn't we use, I think maybe we used like mice cells or something else before. Adult stem cells. Yeah. And it was because it was $300 cheaper. Right. So I was like, all right, well, I will not be participating in this lab. And I think we should really talk about this.
Yeah, and there are some other ones. So like these were some of the other letters. And so if this is something that bothers you, right, as a parent of children who are, asking to be vaccinated, or whatever it is, right? I want you to do your own research. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You need to decide that on your own. But what I am going to say is that if you look for and ask for the inserts that go with these, you can look for any kind of medication, right? Any vaccine. Yes. Because it's not just children, right? You have shingles vaccines and you have COVID vaccines and flu vaccines and all of these different ones that they also push on adults.
The flu is new. The flu is new every year.
Yes. And so if you look at the insert, right, if it has the three letters like that, especially where it's like an H, the HEK 293 was one. There's one that's WI 38, which was a 3-month-old fetus in 1963. That's lung tissue from that. MRC 5 is lung tissue from a 14-week fetus that was aborted in 1966. And then there's PER C6, which is retinal. So that's embryonic retinal tissue, the ER, from 1985. And so then they just keep repopulating these cells, right? But so that, to me, that bothers me. It bothered you, right? Everybody has to determine their own. I mean, that's between you and God. And,
level of botheredness,
right?
Yes,
what you're gonna do. But what our goal here is to help you understand what's happening and look at it, and then to make an informed decision with what you're doing.
Right. 100%.
And so with that, this was going on, right? You have all of these things. This has been going on for years and years and years and years and years and years and years, right? Because these things, like I said, they came from 1963, 1966. They keep repopulating.
Start of the scientific revolution,
right.
Way back whenever that was.
Correct, right? But the thing that is not talked about too, because that I feel like is a little bit more broadly known. People do know about that. There are people who have issues with that don't want that. Mm-hmm. They don't want to use vaccines for that reason alone. In some cases, they're typically used to grow cells. They grow other things in those cells. They use the cells to grow other things,
mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
That's my very scientific explanation
like
of what's
insulin,
happening.
We can use an example of insulin is grown a lot.
in using those embryonic cells.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so with that, let's go back to, and then we'll go on to the other thing. But in between this, I want to say that, so going back to the whole fetal organ trafficking.
Yeah.
Back in 2015, 2016, David Daleiden. This is the Center for Medical Progress. So you can look that up, centerformedicalprogress.org, I believe. And they have all these different videos and information and things that they had. David Daleiden he lived in California, mm-hmm. and he did a 3-year undercover sting trying to see what happened to those what happened to the aborted babies and where they went afterwards. A lot of them, they knew that things were going into medical research currently, so not the old stem cell lines, but current aborted babies were being used for medical research. And because there were go-betweens, right, like mm-hmm. STEM Express and some other ones that were selling these and trying to find what was happening in that. So he did a 3-year-long sting, when imposed as a procurement facility, so like a STEM Express, basically the middleman between the abortion clinics and these labs that do research, right? Mm-hmm. So he posed as this, set up a phony business, right? I mean, I think they set up an actual business, but they weren't actually doing business. They set it up legitimately. Mm-hmm. And we're talking to abortion clinics, specifically a lot of Planned Parenthoods. They were at an abortion conference, which I don't know if people realize that that's a thing where all these abortion providers get together and they have conferences and they talk about this. Well, these conversations were horrendous, right? They're haggling over price for livers and talking about how they can modify what they're doing, right? So they can modify the abortion procedure so that they don't crush organs when they can get these organs out in one piece so that they can sell them, right? Which is against the law. Right. You can't sell human organs.
No,
period.
You cannot.
Right. Born or preborn. Right. You can't sell human organs, right? This is why like black market organ transplant things are against the law. Yes. So, but this was happening on a large scale inside abortion clinics, that this was another revenue stream for them. That they're selling these organs. And this was the evidence that he had, right? So again, this is, at the time, Kamala Harris was the Attorney General in California. There were things that happened in California. She was running for Senate. This was before she was vice president, before she ran for president. AG was running for Senate. Planned Parenthood was one of her donors. She was a big, huge Planned Parenthood donation person, right? They support her more than, I think, just about anybody else. Right. So they met with her. Mm-hmm. She decided, because this thing was coming to light, that he was going to be exposing this. He'd been releasing some of these videos, so they knew that they were on tape, right? They're on video saying these things, admitting to illegal activity. Mm-hmm. So instead of her investigating the illegal activity, what they did was they ordered his home to be raided, and they confiscated all of his evidence. So they confiscated his laptops. I mean, he tells the story, it was like 10 agents that come in, raid his little tiny apartment, take his computers. A lot of that footage just got released just recently. In the last year, there's footage that came out that had been held hostage, right, by this. But this is another example of these ones where I was talking about, like with Kermit Gosnell, he'd been reported, no one investigated him. Mm-hmm. You know, you have all of that undercover footage with girls being told that they were, they were 13, pregnant by someone who was 30. Mm-hmm. No one investigates those things.
Right.
Because, again, we go back to Attorney General of the state that chooses not to investigate those things or looks at them and says, oh, there's nothing going on.
Yeah.
Chooses
not to uphold the law.
Yes.
Yeah.
There was a horrible one with this fetal organ trafficking that went on in New Mexico. New Mexico is a big late-term abortion facility state.
I didn't know.
Oh, yeah. Wow. Through 9 months. That Keisha Atkins was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Southwestern Women's Options. They had on their website that they do abortions for any reason through 32 weeks, and after that on a case-by-case basis. For years, they had that on their website, just announcing it to the world. Anyway, but they had this whole crazy thing that was going on with the University of New Mexico, the Southwestern Women's Options, where it was like Southwestern Women's Options was getting patients sent to them by the university. They're selling their organ, the fetal organs, to the university. The university is training doctors and sending them back to the clinic, and it was going on. Well, when all that video series came out, there was a House Oversight Committee in the U.S. Congress that sent that information to the Attorney General in New Mexico, who looked at it and went, oh, nothing's happening. There's nothing to prosecute here. Because he was also funded by Planned Parenthood.
Follow the money.
Or by the abortion industry, right? He was an abortion supporter and had been funded by abortion activism groups, right? And so it's this little, so those attorney generals are really, really important because this is why this stuff goes on for such a long time.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
So going back to that, then that leads into the other thing that we're going to talk about.
Yes. Okay. We want to segue into the humanized mice now.
Think so, yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Because this relates to what I was just talking about.
Yes, it does. Okay. So another, or I don't even, is it like a business opportunity for them? I would unfortunately call it, is using humanized mice. And so this goes back to not really knowing what the terms are that we're using. So what are humanized mice and how are they connected to abortion?
Yeah. So when did you first hear that? Was it from me or had you heard about it before I talked about it?
I'd heard about it when I was in college doing all of my research and all of like the creative biolabs. And yes, that was when I first kind of got into it. I looked more into it once we started talking about it again, though.
So my bunny trail, how I got onto humanized mice, and this is one of those things that I'll tell people in the hallway, and they'll look at me like I have 3 heads or something.
Humanized mice.
This is actually not a conspiracy theory, right? It's something that's very easy to look at. You can look at PubMed. The NIH they publish all of
Johns
these.
Hopkins.
You were talking about, right? Johns Hopkins, Mayo Clinic, Harvard Medical School, all of these places talk about humanized mice.
They do.
It's one of those things that's like right out in the open, but nobody asks, what is a humanized mouse? So the way that it got started for me was after this whole David Daleiden thing. I was following it, right? And I'm looking at all these videos and I start thinking, well, what are they doing with these organs, right? Where are they going and what are they doing with them? And so then this was back in 2015, 2016 when that first went around. Okay, so think about it. That's been almost a decade. Nothing has happened. None of that stuff, very little has happened on that front to hold anybody accountable for those things.
Yeah.
So, I started thinking, what are they doing with these organs? Because it's obviously a lucrative thing that people are purchasing these organs. What are they doing with them?
And that they want to cover up.
Yes. Right?
So,
and so what are they doing with them? So I had this question kind of rolling around in my head. Well, then enter into COVID era, right? And people are asking me questions about, okay, are they using aborted babies to make the COVID vaccines? Looking at all that stuff. So I started looking into information, just trying to find out answers for myself and to be able to help other people learn what they were doing. Because they were deciding whether or not to take it, all those things.
Right.
So I started seeing all these articles talking about humanized mice. And I'm reading it going, what the heck is a humanized mouse? How does one humanize a mouse? Like Dr. Moreau, what are we doing? How are we?
What's going on?
Yeah. I mean, seriously, how do you humanize a mouse? Well, at first it was a little difficult to find information, but then once I figured out how to word it on the internet properly, so then it got to the point where I was getting ads asking me if I wanted to purchase humanized mice because they thought I was a buyer.
That's always my biggest fear. Sometimes I'm like, please Please don't look at my search history.
Oh my gosh. I know I have some crazy search histories on mine from the stuff that I look up. But I started looking at what they are. So I guess it's been going on for decades. They've been humanizing mice, and right? I mean,
unregulated things that people don't even.
Well, and I'm sure that there are some regulations, but it's like the fact that we're doing this with human organs, and that in a lot of ways, the way that they classify it is not, it doesn't raise a red flag like what you were talking about with the HEK, right? It doesn't say that it's an embryonic tissue, right? So it doesn't say it, so then it's like the funding is there for things that you don't realize it's embryonic still, like they can get away with kind of hiding it,
right?
And nobody's really looking too hard, right? So it's like with the clinics, those are not regulated at all. With the things with the labs, they do this sort of maneuvering in the way that they word things to make it look like it's something that it's not, or not look like it's something that it is, right?
Yeah.
However you want to word that. But anyway, with humanized mice, they used to take baby mice and irradiate them to make their immune systems weak, and then implant pieces of organs in like a organ transplant, right? Or engraft it onto their existing liver. They didn't graft it. Well, now they've gotten to where they can actually genetically manipulate and breed immunodeficient mice. So they breed them where their immune systems are compromised when they're born, and then they can engraft whatever they want. Well, they've discovered that if they engraft certain things, that it makes them have an immune response like a person. So therefore, it's a humanized mouse because it's got the immune response of a human being, so that they can test drugs, they can test diseases, they can test whatever on these mice, because the mice, so like, for example, going back to COVID, mice cannot catch COVID. So you can't, they just, for whatever reason, they don't catch coronaviruses, which have been going on longer than, 2020. There were coronaviruses before, but mice are incapable of contracting it.
Yes.
So this was one of the things that I discovered was like, okay, the only way for them to test COVID vaccines on these mice is if they humanize them, because that's the only way they can contract it.
Yep.
So, yeah.
I was going to say, because what most people realize is mice are used in a bunch of different studies and used a lot because they're cheap. They're cheap. They recreate quickly, small, easy to study, and you can have a lot of them.
Right.
But the biggest difference between mice and humans is our immune system. And so once they figured out how to kick that down, it was like, oh, the gates are open. We can do anything now and manipulate and grow and put things in, and
without ever stopping to ask, should we be doing this, right?
100%.
So they have these, and this is not just about COVID, right? This is about a lot, because like a lot of the AIDS research has this, some of the hepatitis research, there's a lot of different things that they're using humanized mice because of the immune system, responding like a human. And so they take these, but these are freshly aborted babies. So if you look, so the one that I always point people to, because it's really easy to find, is a BLT mouse. I first found it on Harvard Medical website, but it's on all other places. So BLT mouse is bone marrow, liver, thymus. But I forget what it is. It's like autologous, or I think is the way that you say that word, autologous, which means that it has to all come from the same organism, right? So thank you for helping me with that. I think it's autologous is how you say that word. But that if you see that in anything, that means it's the bone marrow, liver, thymus from one organism. So from one baby, which means this is not these old cell lines that we're talking about. Correct. This is a freshly aborted baby that they're taking these cells from, taking little pieces of their bone marrow, liver, and thymus, which there's another side of that is, okay, the fact that we can take that from a 14-week-old baby, a thymus or bone marrow, if you think about how intricately designed they are, that at that small of an age that they can extract bone marrow from a 14-week baby, right? Yep. It tells you how developed they are, which exposes a whole other level of lies of the abortion industry. But for these purposes, right, they're taking these things, they're putting them in this mouse to create a BLT mouse and then doing testing. reporting on it, right? So there's big money in this because there's a lot of, in the medical research, the pharmaceutical industry, there's a lot of stuff. And the abortion industry is super tied to the medical research industry, which again, it's just, and then you have government officials that cover it up, that are making money from the pharmaceutical industry to overlook these things. And meanwhile, I mean, we're talking about like Nazi Germany level experimentation on human beings that, you know, people wonder, why did they not ever look at what was being done, some of the medical experiments that were just horrendous that were happening, right? Well, we're doing the same thing
100%.
now. We are. I mean, because you have little tiny babies, and one of the things. So we're going to need to wrap this up here quickly. But one of the big things with this is that if you're talking about, I mean, just to think about this, right? If you're doing any kind of organ transplant, right? When you look this stuff up, look for the word graft or engraft, engraft. This is how I started finding these things, right? Yeah. It's like grafting of human fetal liver or something, and you find these studies, right, where they publish all of this stuff that they've done. Yep. There's ones where they've taken scalps and done them on like mice to grow hair, to see how they can grow hair on them, little baby scalps, right? It's awful. But those things, in order for transplants, for grafts to take, there's a very short time window because otherwise that tissue dies. Right. Like, you know, you see things in movies, right, where someone's walking with a little cooler with a heart in it because you do a heart transplant. They have a limited window of time when they can do that, which means this pipeline is very streamlined, right? So you have instances where there are people sitting in abortion clinics that the abortion providers are changing the way that they're doing the procedures to get intact organs, or in some cases, complete intact babies. Yeah. Because they can't use certain drugs because it ruins the tissues, right? Which makes them not able to be used for research. Right. So there's some question about whether babies are being born alive. That's a valid question because if you can't use the drugs that kill the babies in the womb, 100%. There's a good chance that they're being born alive and then being butchered, right? Yes. So there's some really serious ethical questions about how are they getting these things so quickly into these mice that in order within that time window that these organs are still viable, right? So it's a very streamlined process, and nobody is looking into this. Like, this is something that has been going on. We've known about it for a decade, right? More than that in some cases, and nobody with any power is looking into it.
Yeah. Which is crazy, which is why we need to keep talking about it. And
so you can talk to somebody and they'll look at you like you have 3 heads.
Yes, but then you can educate them, and then it's this great thing. And then you can just make people look at you weird, and when you're talking about humanized mice at the dinner table. But I thought of this when we were talking really quick while we're wrapping up. Have you ever read the book How Do You Kill 11 Million People? By Andy Andrews?
I have not.
It's a great read, highly recommend. But it's basically about lying to people, and that's how you're able to do it. And so that's why we need to uncover the lies, shine the light in the dark places, because these are things that people don't want to talk about. They're hard and disgusting, honestly. So, but...
And so in looking at all of these things about why all of these drugs are able to be advertised on the television, why there's such a connection between politicians and the pharmaceutical industry, this has to be part of that conversation and looking at it and demanding answers, right? Demanding to know what is actually happening. And especially now in Arizona, right? Now that we have Prop 139 passed, this means that these late-term abortions will be legal in Arizona, right? This is why they fight so hard, in my opinion.
Right, it's true.
I mean, in my opinion, this is why they fight to keep second trimester abortions legal. Third trimester are also legal, but it's a little harder to get the viable organs, right? It's really that second trimester where they use this for those things. But this is why they fight so hard to keep it. This is also why, again, Attorney General is a big deal, because the Attorney General decides, just like we said in New Mexico, the Attorney General that looked and said, oh, no crimes are being committed. So we need to
Kamala
have...
Harris.
Right? Kamala Harris
Attorney
in California,
General.
when she was the Attorney General, confiscated the evidence of wrongdoing, right? And they sued the They sued the journalist.
Right.
He just got those charges dropped.
That's
Just this year. Like, it had been almost a 10-year fight. Yeah, look it up on Center for Medical Progress. There's all kinds of information about the fight that he had. All of this stuff. So we kind of talked about a lot of things and gave you a lot of places to go look for information. I know it's tough to listen to and to take, but it's so important that if we as believers are not looking at these things, this is why they're allowed to go on.
Yep,
right?
It's true.
It's why they're allowed to continue to go on. If we're not looking at them and speaking up and saying, no, why, how is this even like my epiphany back 20 years ago, where I was looking at the, partial birth abortion, saying, how are we even discussing that this is whether or not this is okay?
Yeah.
That's the conversation we need to be having about humanized mice. Who is defending this process? Like, does the public actually know what's happening?
Exactly.
Right? And would they be appalled if they knew the level of things that are happening? So it is an important thing I know it's tough to look at, but it's important that we don't go in, because that's where the enemy reigns, in darkness.
Yes,
right?
100%. Yeah. So we are shining a light on the dark underbelly of the abortion industry.
Yes. So with all of that, I know you may need some time to process all of that. Pay attention to Attorney General. Look up some of the information that we shared. Don't just take our word for it. And so thank you so much for joining us on Into the Fire, powered by Dream City Church.
You can listen to this podcast on Apple and Spotify and follow us on social media. Find all the info on the show notes. To learn more about Dream City Church, visit our website at dreamcitychurch.us. Thanks for listening.